The moment Myrtle Langston stepped off the stagecoach in Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1878, she knew with absolute certainty that someone had just stolen her horse, her luggage, and what little remained of her dignity, and the broad-shouldered cowboy leaning against the post office wall was trying very hard not to laugh about it. Dust swirled around her ankles in great amber clouds, and the Kansas wind was nothing like the polite breezes she had grown up with in Missouri. It was rude and insistent, pulling at the pins in her dark auburn hair and flipping the brim of her traveling hat sideways so that she was quite sure, like a woman who had lost an argument with the weather, which, in every meaningful way, she had. The stagecoach driver, a leathery old man named Potts, climbed down from his seat with the unhurried manner of someone who had delivered bad news many times before. "Your trunk and your mare got separated from the coach back in Wellington," he told her. "Had to cut the extra horse loose when the road washed out. Sheriff, there's holding your belongings if you want to wire ahead." Myrtle stared at him. She was 26 years old, she had sold everything she owned in Hannibal to come out here, and she had exactly $3 and a pair of earrings her grandmother had left her. She pressed her lips together in the way that women of her generation had been taught to do when they wanted to scream. "Thank you, Mr. Potts," she said, with great precision. She picked up the single carpetbag that had traveled inside the coach with her and turned to face the town of Caldwell. It was not an impressive sight. There was a main street with the standard arrangement of establishments: a saloon, a dry goods store, a land office, a barber shop, a hotel that called itself the Prairie Rose, and beyond that on either side wooden houses, some with gardens, some without. In the far distance, cattle country stretched endlessly in every direction, flat and gold and enormous, interrupted only by occasional clusters of cottonwood trees along creek beds. The cowboy had stopped pretending not to laugh. He had turned away to cough into his fist, which was, Myrtle thought, at least an attempt at manners. "You looking for something in particular?" he asked, once he had recovered himself. She turned to look at him properly. He was tall, somewhere in his early 30s, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that curled slightly at the collar of his blue work shirt. He had a jaw that looked like it had been carved with an intention toward stubbornness, and dark eyes that were currently full of something warm and interested, which she found simultaneously flattering and irritating. "I'm looking for Dr. Elmore Langston," she said. "He's my uncle. He operates a medical practice here." The cowboy's expression shifted into something more careful. He straightened up from his lean against the post office wall. "You're Doc Langston's niece," he said. "I am, Myrtle Langston. And before you say anything else, I am well aware that I look like someone dragged through a river." "I wasn't going to say that," he said. His voice was quiet and even the kind that didn't need to be raised to be heard. "I was going to say that the doc's office is down that way, third building on the left past the hardware store, and I was sorry to hear about your uncle." Myrtle went still. "What do you mean, sorry to hear about him?" The cowboy looked at her steadily, and something in his expression made her stomach drop before he even opened his mouth. "He had a bad fall 3 weeks ago, Miss Langston. Off his roof, he was fixing a leak. He broke his hip. He's been confined to bed, and Dr. Whitfield from Medicine Lodge has been coming out when he can, but he's an old man and the recovery has been hard." The wind pushed at her back. She had come all this way, she had left her teaching position, her small room above the seamstress's shop, the only life she had known since her parents died, because her uncle's letter had offered her a home and useful work assisting in his practice. She had not known that by the time she arrived, her uncle would be the one needing care. She took one slow breath, then another. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "What is your name?" "Nathan Collier," he said. He touched the brim of his hat. "I run cattle out on the Flint Creek spread about 6 miles east of town. I've known your uncle for some years. He's a good man." "He is," she agreed. "Will you show me the way to his office, Mr. Collier? I seem to have misplaced my bearings along with my horse and my luggage." The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was heading in that direction. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and fell into step beside her. Walking down Caldwell's Main Street with Nathan Collier, Myrtle noticed several things in quick succession. She noticed that people greeted him by name and that he greeted them back with a brief nod and a word or two that suggested he was neither unfriendly nor particularly chatty. She noticed that he walked at a pace that matched hers without making a production of it, which was something that men in her experience tended to forget to do. She noticed that he smelled of wood smoke and leather and the clean outdoor smell of open grassland, which was not an unpleasant combination. She also noticed that he kept stealing careful sideways glances at her in a way that he probably thought was subtle. "How long have you been in Caldwell, Mr. Collier?" she asked, keeping her eyes on the street ahead. "Going on 5 years," he said. "Came up from Texas after the war settled things down enough to make cattle driving profitable. Worked for a rancher named Holt for 3 years, then started my own operation. It's small yet, but it's mine." "You have land of your own, 340 acres, he said. It was said plainly without boasting, which she appreciated. "Enough to run about 200 head right now. I'm hoping to increase that by fall." "And you are unmarried?" she asked, and then felt her face warm slightly because it was a forward question, and she had asked it before she thought it through. He glanced at her sidelong. There was definite amusement in it now. "I am," he said. "And you?" "Widowed," she said quietly. 3 years ago. My husband was a schoolteacher. Fever took him." "I'm sorry," Nathan said, and he said it simply and meant it, and that was the right response, and she was grateful for it. They reached the office of Dr. Elmore Langston, which occupied the ground floor of a narrow 2-story building with a wooden sign above the door. The curtains in the window were drawn. Nathan opened the door for her and she stepped inside. Her uncle lay in the bed that had been moved into the front room, so he would not have to navigate the stairs. He was a compact, white-haired man of 62, with Langston eyes dark and intelligent and stubborn, and a neatly trimmed beard that had grown more untidy in the weeks of his confinement. When Myrtle appeared in the doorway, his face opened into such genuine relief and joy that she felt her eyes sting. "Myrtle, girl," he said, reaching for her hand. "You came all this way." "Of course I came," she said, sitting on the edge of his bed and taking his hand in both of hers. "Though I must say, Uncle Elmore, your timing could have been better." He chuckled and winced and then chuckled again more carefully. "Damned roof. Should have hired it done. Nathan, is that you back there?" "Yes, sir," Nathan said from the doorway, holding his hat in his hands. Good man for bringing her." The old doctor looked at his niece. "How was the journey?" "Eventful," she said. "But I am here, and I am well, and you are going to tell me everything I need to know about your patients and your medicines and your instruments, because starting tomorrow I am going to do what I can to keep this practice running until you are back on your feet." Elmore Langston regarded his niece with great fondness and a little pride. "You always were a practical creature," he said. "I had a practical teacher," she said, and squeezed his hand. Nathan left them to their reunion and walked back out into the afternoon sun. He stood on the boardwalk for a moment, turning his hat in his hands, looking down the street at nothing in particular. He thought about Myrtle Langston, the way she had stood in the dust with her hat sideways and her bag at her feet and her spine perfectly straight, taking bad news as though she had decided some time ago to simply receive whatever life handed her and deal with it. He thought about the way she had asked his name and shaken his hand as if she were greeting an equal, which in his experience women of education did not always manage. He put his hat on and walked to his horse, untied the reins from the hitching rail, and swung up into the saddle. He had cattle to check on and fences to ride, but he was already thinking, in the back of his mind, about an excuse to come back to town. The days that followed were long and full for Myrtle. She threw herself into the work of managing her uncle's practice with the same purposeful intensity she had always brought to difficult situations. She had not trained as a physician. That was not an open road for women in 1878, though she knew it was a road some extraordinary women were beginning to walk. But she had helped her uncle during summer visits throughout her childhood, and she had read every medical text he owned. She could identify common ailments, administer standard remedies, clean and bandage wounds, and assess when something was beyond her capacity and needed a real physician's hands. The people of Caldwell came to her cautiously at first. There was a general wariness toward change, and a woman running a doctor's office, even as a stand-in, was change. But Caldwell was a cattle town at the edge of the great open range, and people in cattle towns had pragmatic souls born of necessity. When Myrtle set a ranch hand's broken finger with neat efficiency and gave him something for the pain and charged him exactly what her uncle's ledger said the service cost, word got around that she was competent. When she correctly identified that a rancher's wife was not suffering from consumption but from the dust and mold in their root cellar and told them what to do about it, word got around faster. Her uncle watched all of this from his bed with great satisfaction. He was improving slowly. The hip had not broken so badly that it could not heal, but at his age the healing was a long process, and Dr. Whitfield, who came from Medicine Lodge every 2 weeks, had told him very plainly that he was to stay off the leg for at least 2 months more. Nathan Collier came to town on Saturdays to collect supplies, and once during the week to check the cattle prices being posted at the land office. He always found a reason to stop at the doctor's office. At first it was to inquire after the doctor's health, which was legitimate enough, since they were genuinely friends. Then it was to bring a supply of firewood that he'd cut himself and thought the old man might need. Then it was to bring a late spring rabbit he'd shot, because he figured they might not be eating well. Then it was simply because he came and Myrtle was there, and they sat at the small kitchen table behind the office while the doctor dozed and they talked. They talked about everything. They talked about Missouri and Texas and what it had been like to grow up in very different landscapes and find themselves in the same flat golden prairie. They talked about cattle drives and the Kansas fever tick, and the political battles between the cattle interests and the farming settlements that were slowly fencing off the old open range. They talked about books. Myrtle was a reader and was pleasantly surprised to find that Nathan, who had finished his schooling early, had continued to educate himself through a serious habit of borrowing from lending libraries and acquiring volumes when he could. They talked about the Cheyenne and the Arapaho and the injustice of what had been done and was being done to the nations whose land this had always been, which was a subject that most people in Caldwell did not discuss openly. Nathan had worked long enough on the range to have developed views on it that were more uncomfortable and more honest than the comfortable narratives that newspapers preferred. "You're not what I expected," Myrtle told him one Saturday evening in May when the light through the office window had gone all gold and soft. "What did you expect?" he asked. She considered this honestly. "A man who talks about cattle and horses and not much else," she said. "I don't mean that as an insult. Most of the men I have met since coming here are decent and hardworking and exactly that. There is nothing wrong with it. But you find it hard to talk to," he said without offense. "I find it hard to be fully present in," she said carefully. I miss conversations that go somewhere, that turn something over and look at the underside of it." Nathan was quiet for a moment looking at the tabletop. Then he looked up at her. "My father was a reader," he said. "He read everything he could find, raised me to think that understanding things was important even when you couldn't change them. I didn't have much formal schooling, but I had him for the first 14 years, and that was more than most people get." "He passed away?" she asked gently. "Fever, same as your husband," he said. 1864. I was 14. I went to work and kept working, and I don't think I've really stopped since." He paused. "I don't say that to make you feel sorry for me. I'm saying it because you asked what kind of man I am, and that's part of it. Work and books and a piece of land, that's mine. That's what I have." Myrtle looked at him across the small table in the kitchen behind the doctor's office in the long spring light of a Kansas evening, and thought that what he had sounded very much like enough. More than enough. More, in fact, than she had thought she would find in Caldwell. She looked away before he could see too much in her face, and poured them both more coffee, and asked him about the condition of the Kishome Trail north of town. In June, a complication arose that nobody had anticipated. A man named Gerald Fitch arrived in Caldwell with a document claiming that Elmore Langston owed him a debt of $140 dating back to a land transaction in 1874. Fitch was a compact, humorless man with a mustache he was very serious about, and he had a lawyer with him from Wichita, which was a bad sign. Elmore, propped up in his bed with his legs still refusing to cooperate fully, showed Myrtle the papers with the resigned expression of a man who had been hoping this matter had gone away. "I did borrow money from him," the doctor admitted. "It was for the building extension, the one at the back of the office. I have paid most of it back, but the last $40 was disputed. I claimed there was interest already paid that he never credited. He has apparently decided to make a legal matter of it." "And if you cannot pay?" Myrtle asked. "He says he will pursue the lien against the building," Elmore said, "which would mean the office." Myrtle sat with this information the way she sat with all difficult information, quietly and without panic, working through it in her mind. "How long do we have before any action can be taken?" "Fitch says he'll file in county court in 3 weeks, Elmore said. "The Wichita lawyer seems confident." "Then we have 3 weeks, Myrtle said. "I'll write to the State Medical Association about the disputed interest payments, and I will look through your ledgers and find every record of payment you have made to Fitch. We will document this properly." She was doing exactly that, sitting at the small desk in the back room with the ledgers spread open before her, when Nathan arrived the following Tuesday with a sack of sweet corn from a farm down the road and the cheerful manner of someone who has not yet heard about a problem. He listened to the whole story without interrupting. Then he sat down across from her. "Fitch," he said, in a tone that suggested familiarity. "Gerald Fitch. He was in the land business over in Sumner County before he came here. He has a habit of doing this, letting debts sit and then pursuing them when the debtor is in a weakened position." "You know him," Myrtle said. "I know of him. One of the ranchers near my spread, a man named Dulin, had a similar experience. He got it resolved because he had kept every receipt, every scrap of paper." Nathan looked at the ledgers. "Has your uncle kept records like that?" "Thorough ones," Myrtle said. "Which is why I believe we can prove the interest was paid. But he needs legal representation, and the lawyer from Wichita that Fitch has brought, Bill Casterman," Nathan said. "He is good and he knows it and charges for it accordingly." He thought for a moment. "There is a man in Medicine Lodge named Hartley who handled Dulin's case. He is not as expensive and he is honest, which is rarer than it should be. I can ride to Medicine Lodge on Thursday and talk to him." Myrtle looked at him across the desk covered in her uncle's papers. "Mr. Collier," she said carefully, "you don't have to involve yourself in this." "It is not your Miss Langston," he said, equally carefully. "Your uncle set my hand after I broke 3 fingers in a rope accident 2 years ago. He refused to charge me because he said I was a frequent source of entertainment and he was happy to consider that payment enough. I am going to Medicine Lodge on Thursday." She looked at him for a moment longer than was strictly comfortable. Then she said, "Thank you, Nathan." It was the first time she had used his given name. He noticed. She noticed that he noticed. Neither of them said anything about it, but the temperature in the small room seemed to shift slightly. He went to Medicine Lodge on Thursday and returned on Friday with the lawyer Hartley, who was a patient, methodical man of 50 who wore reading glasses and asked for every document in chronological order, and spent an entire afternoon going through the ledgers while Elmore directed him from the bed, and Myrtle organized the papers and made the 3 of them strong black tea. Hartley was confident by the end of the day. The interest payments had indeed been made and recorded. Fitch's case, properly challenged, was thin. The matter was presented in the county court 3 weeks later. Myrtle sat in the gallery and kept her hands folded in her lap with great deliberateness, and dismissed. Fitch's lawyer from Wichita wore a sour expression leaving the courthouse, and Fitch himself did not return to Caldwell. The evening after the court decision, Nathan brought a bottle of whiskey to the doctor's office. Elmore had finally been permitted to sit up in a chair, and he toasted his own stubbornness with evident satisfaction. Myrtle allowed herself a small measure in a teacup because that was all that was available, and drank it in the spirit in which it was offered. "To practical women and good lawyers and stubborn old doctors," Nathan said, raising his glass. "And to the man who rode to Medicine Lodge," Myrtle said, and met his eyes as she said it and didn't look away this time. Summer arrived in Kansas with the force of a physical event. The heat came down from the sky and rose up from the earth simultaneously, and met in the middle with the cheerful cruelty of a place that had never promised anyone comfort. The prairie turned from green to a deeper, dustier gold. The cattle moved slowly in the mornings before the heat peaked. The creeks dropped low in their beds. Myrtle adapted. She moved through the heat with the efficiency of someone who had decided to simply accept that she would always be too warm. Pinning her hair up and wearing the lightest cotton dresses she had been able to acquire from the dry goods store. She kept the office windows open and the curtains half drawn, creating what shade and drafts she could. She learned that the best time to visit outlying farms was early morning, before 7, which meant she was sometimes on the road in the pre-dawn gray on the horse she had borrowed from the town livery, a stout and reliable bay mare named Biscuit who had no particular aspirations beyond steady plodding. She learned which roads crossed which, and which creek crossings were reliable after rain and which were not. She learned that certain ranch families out east of town had not had decent medical attention since her uncle's accident, and that they were privately grateful beyond what they easily expressed. She attended 2 births, assisting at them as best she could, keeping calm and clear-voiced through the complicated hours, arriving home afterward in the gray dawn exhausted in a way that felt earned. Both mothers and both babies survived. Her uncle watched her with an expression that combined pride and a softer emotion he didn't put words to. Nathan's ranch was 6 miles east, which meant she passed the turnoff for the Flint Creek spread regularly on her rounds. She did not stop there without purpose. That would have been forward in a way she was not ready to be, but she noticed the track turning off between the stands of cottonwood and thought about it. The purpose arrived in mid-July when one of Nathan's hands, a young man of about 20 named Pete Granger, came into the office with his arm torn up from a barbed wire fence. It was a genuine mess, and Myrtle spent the better part of 2 hours cleaning and closing it properly, while Pete sweated and gripped the edge of the treatment table, and insisted he was fine in a voice that contradicted everything it said. When she was done, she told him the arm needed watching for infection and that he was to come back in 3 days. "Can't leave the ranch for 3 days," he said. "We're driving the summer stock to the pens. Nathan needs me." "Then I will come to the ranch," Myrtle said. So she drove the buckboard. She had learned to handle it reasonably well by now out the 6 miles to Flint Creek, with Pete beside her directing, on a blazing Wednesday morning in July. The Flint Creek spread was smaller than some of the operations she'd heard about. 200 head of longhorn cattle grazing in the creek-watered pastures, a solid barn, a working stable, a bunkhouse for the hands, and the main house, which was a 1-story structure of timber and stone that was modest but clearly built to last. There were 3 ranch hands besides Pete, and they greeted her with the combination of wariness and hopefulness that men have toward medical professionals when they are themselves not the patient. Nathan was down at the fence line when she arrived. He walked up from the south pasture when one of the hands hollered to him, and he pulled off his gloves when he saw the buckboard and the figure sitting on the seat, and something in his face changed in a way that he was not managing particularly well. It was a slightly overwhelmed expression, quickly controlled, but she caught it, and it did something warm and complicated to her chest. "Miss Langston," he said, coming up to the buckboard. "Pete's arm needs checking," she said. "He tells me he can't leave the ranch this week." "He can't," Nathan agreed, looking at Pete, "which I told him was going to be a problem." "It is not a problem," Myrtle said, climbing down from the buckboard without waiting for assistance and picking up her medical bag. "Take me where I can see him properly." She worked at the kitchen table of the main house while Nathan waited outside and the other hands found things to do at a careful distance. Pete's arm was holding up reasonably well, no early signs of infection, the stitches intact, and she rebandaged it and gave him a small paper of sulfur powder and instructions that she wrote out in clear handwriting because she had a feeling Pete might not fully remember what she said. When she came out, Nathan was sitting on the porch steps, waiting. "Is he going to be all right?" he asked, standing. "He will if he keeps it clean," she said. She looked out over the pasture to where the cattle moved in the slow, incurious way of cattle in heat. The cottonwood trees along the creek were pale and still in the windless midday air. "You have a fine place here," she said. "It's coming along," he said. There was a note in his voice that she recognized as a man choosing understatement because the full truth felt exposed. She understood it. She felt it herself sometimes about work she had done that had gone well. "Can I see the creek?" she said. He looked at her for a moment, this woman standing on his porch in her summer dress with her medical bag at her feet, asking to see the creek on a July noon. "The cottonwoods give some shade," he said. "Come on." They walked down through the south pasture in the full heat, following a path that was worn by cattle and by Nathan's own boots, down to where the land dropped slightly to the creek bed. The cottonwoods were old and broad, and the shade they threw was genuine and deep, and the creek ran shallow over flat limestone slabs, clear and cold-looking where it moved, dark and still in the deeper pools. Myrtle stood on the bank and took off her hat and let the shade and the faint moisture in the air cool her face. "My uncle tells me you came to Caldwell with nothing," she said, not looking at him. "He says you had a horse, a saddle, and $12 when you arrived. And a letter of introduction from my old employer in Texas," Nathan said, coming to stand beside her. "Which wasn't worth much, but it got me an interview with Holt. And you built all of this in 5 years." "I worked very hard," he said simply. "I know," she said. She turned to look at him. He was very close in the narrow shade of the cottonwood they were standing under, and she was aware of that in a way she had not been aware of anything so acutely in 3 years. "Nathan." "Myrtle," he said, and the way he said her name, she had noticed he had been saying it to himself in her presence for the past few weeks. Testing the sound of it was quiet and careful, the way he did everything. "I have been trying," she said, "to determine whether what I believe is happening between us is in fact happening, or whether I am constructing something out of loneliness and gratitude and a shortage of interesting conversation." He was very still. The creek ran over the limestone slabs with a small, unceasing sound. "It is happening," he said. "I thought so," she said. "I wanted to hear you say it." He looked at her for a long moment with those dark, careful eyes, and then he reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face where it had come loose in the walk down to the creek, just lightly, just the back of his fingers against her cheek, and she let him. "I'm not practiced at this," he said. "At saying things." "Neither am I," she said. "At hearing them, we'll manage." He smiled then, a real one, not the controlled almost smile she had seen over the past weeks, and it changed his face entirely, opened it, made him look younger and more vulnerable than she had seen him yet, and she thought that this was the truest face he had, the one he kept carefully behind the steady, composed exterior, and she felt the weight of being trusted with it. She did not permit herself to do anything precipitate. She was a practical woman, and she knew that feelings in the shade of a cottonwood on a July afternoon were one thing and a life built was another. She picked up her hat and put it back on. "I should start back," she said. "My uncle will be wondering." "I'll ride with you to the road," Nathan said. "You don't have to. I know I don't have to," he said, going to get his horse. He rode beside the buckboard for the 6 miles back to the Caldwell road, and they talked easily, with none of the careful navigation of before, as if saying the true thing had opened a door that allowed all the comfortable things to walk through freely after it. He turned back at the road junction, and they held each other's gaze for a moment. And then Myrtle clicked Biscuit into motion, and drove back to town with her heart doing something she hadn't allowed it to do in 3 years. Elmore Langston, who was now up and managing short walks with a cane, looked at his niece's face when she came in and smiled into his teacup. "Good visit?" he asked. "Productive," she said, hanging her hat on the peg. Said Elmore. August brought a cattle drive-through from the south, 2,000 head of longhorns moving up the Kishom Trail toward the rail pens at Caldwell, which had been expanding its position as a shipping point. The town filled up with trail hands, and the saloons went into long days, and Myrtle was busier than she had been yet, dealing with the ordinary injuries of men who had ridden hard for weeks and were now in a town with whiskey and celebratory instincts. Nathan was not part of the drive. His own cattle were not ready for market yet, and he did not work hired. But he came to town in those busy days more than usual, and once he came specifically because he had heard that a dispute at one of the saloons had gotten loud, and he wanted to make sure Myrtle was not caught in the vicinity of it. She was not. She was 2 streets away, stitching up a cut on a trail hand's forehead with perfect concentration. And when Nathan found her and stood in the doorway of the office, watching her work with neat efficiency while the cowboy in the chair tried very hard not to react to the needle, Nathan's expression was one that Elmore, watching from his chair, recognized immediately from 40 years of observing people. The doctor said nothing. He picked up his medical journal and read it. On a Saturday evening in late August, Nathan asked Myrtle if she would walk with him. "Walk where?" she said. "There is a rise about a mile east of town," he said, "where you can see the sunset over the whole of the prairie. I thought you might not have seen it yet." She hadn't. She went and got her shawl because the evenings were cooling and told her uncle she would be back before full dark. They walked east along the road in the long amber light of the Kansas evening, leaving the sounds of the town behind them. Nathan was quiet in a comfortable way, the kind of quiet that didn't need filling. The road was dry and firm underfoot, and the grasslands on either side moved slightly in the evening breeze like a slow tide. The sky ahead of them was doing something extraordinary, going from pale gold at the horizon up through shades of orange and deep rose to a blue-green at the zenith that she had no precise name for, and the low sun threw their shadows out long and dark behind them. When they reached the rise, a gentle swell of ground that gave a broader view of the flat horizon, they stopped and stood and watched the sun go down. It was not an event in the sky so much as a conversation between the sky and the land, the colors changing and deepening, and reflecting back from the ground in ways that made the whole prairie seem briefly luminous, as if the grass itself were lit from within. "I have never seen anything like this in Missouri," Myrtle said quietly. "No," Nathan agreed. She looked at him. He was watching the sunset with a straightforward appreciation, no performance in it, just a man who had lived in this landscape long enough to love it. "I think I could come to love it here," she said. He looked at her then, and there was a question in his look that went further than what she had said, and she let him look. "Myrtle," he said. "Nathan," she said. "I am not a man who says things easily," he said. "You know that by now, but I want to say something plainly because you deserve plain speaking and not a lot of circling around." "All right," she said. "I have been alone a long time," he said. "By choice mostly, or what I told myself was choice. It was easier than wanting something and being uncertain." He stopped, tried again. "I am not uncertain about you. I have not been uncertain since the day you stood in the dust outside the Stagecoach office with your hat sideways and told me you were looking for your uncle. I don't know exactly what that means in terms of what I am allowed to ask yet, but I wanted you to know it." She looked at him in the deep rose and gold of the last light. "You are allowed to ask anything you like," she said, "within reason." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "Would you allow me to court you?" He said, formally, properly, with intention toward something more permanent. The last light was on his face, and she could see every line of his expression, the seriousness and the hope and the barely managed vulnerability. And she thought of the man who had come up the trail with $12 and a letter and built himself a life with his hands, and who had ridden to Medicine Lodge for her uncle without being asked, and who had talked to her across a kitchen table as if her thoughts were worth the trouble of listening to. "Yes, Nathan," she said. "I will allow that." He exhaled slowly, as if he had been holding more than he realized. Then he reached out and took her hand, just her hand, firmly and simply, and they stood on the rise and watched the last of the sun go down into the Kansas horizon, and the stars began to appear in the deepening sky, one by one, and the prairie grass whispered in the cooling air. They walked back to town in the near dark, her hand still in his, talking about small things, about whether it would rain before the end of the month, and whether Pete's arm was healing properly, and whether Elmore was likely to overdo things as soon as he felt confident on the cane. The ordinary things. The things people talk about when they are building something together. Elmore was still awake when she came in, reading by lamplight. He looked at her face and then at the door she had come through as if he might see something in the air she had brought with her. "Nice walk," he said. "Very nice," she said. "Uncle Elmore, are you going to pretend you don't know exactly what is happening?" He lowered his book and smiled. "I have been rooting for the man since the third time he brought firewood we didn't need," he said. "Good night, Myrtle." September came with a change in the air, a coolness that arrived each morning before the sun burned it off, a reminder that the land had seasons and moods that followed their own logic. The cattle season was winding down, the last of the trail drives having passed through, and Caldwell settled back into its ordinary rhythms. Nathan came to town every Saturday, always stopping at the doctor's office, and on those evenings he and Myrtle walked or sat on the porch in the cooling air or, increasingly often, rode out together in the late afternoon on the two horses, Biscuit on loan from the livery, Nathan's own horse, a large, serious gray named Steadfast, who had a way of turning his head to look at people as if judging their character. Myrtle liked riding. She had ridden as a girl and taken it up again with the borrowed mare, and she liked the particular freedom of being on a horse in open country, the way the prairie spread in every direction without limit. Nathan was a natural horseman, easy and unstudied in the saddle, and he could read the land point out where a creek ran underground before it surfaced, where the antelope gathered at certain hours, where the hawks sat their territory lines. He taught her things about the country she was living in with a quiet enthusiasm that she found more attractive than she could reasonably explain. One Saturday evening in late September, as they were riding back toward town along the creek road, a thunderstorm came up from the southwest with the abrupt severity that Kansas storms had, going from a dark bank on the horizon to overhead in less time than seemed reasonable. The light went yellow and green, and the wind picked up hard, and the rain began in great heavy drops that became a full downpour in seconds. Nathan pulled Steadfast up and looked at the sky with the assessing expression of a man deciding between options. "The Braddock farm is a quarter-mile north," he said, over the sound of the rain. "We can get to the barn." They rode hard north and made the Braddock barn just as the storm hit its full force. The horses were uneasy but managing, and Nathan got them both stalled and settled with the efficient speed of someone who had done it in worse conditions. The barn was solid and the roof held, and outside the storm threw itself against the walls and lit the cracks with lightning, and made an enormous sound on the tin overhang above the stall doors. Myrtle stood in the center aisle of the barn and wrung water out of the end of her braid, then started laughing because there was nothing else to do about it. Nathan looked at her from where he was rubbing down Steadfast with a handful of clean straw and started laughing too, which she had not heard him do fully before. It was a real laugh, unguarded, and it suited him enormously. "Your hat is done for," he said, nodding at the drooping object that had slid to a tragic angle. "It was not my best hat," she said, pulling it off and looking at it. "That is the one thing I can say for this situation." She sat down on a hay bale and spread her wet skirt to the extent possible and pinned her braid back into some kind of order. Nathan finished with the horses and came to sit on the bale across from her. The storm raged outside. The barn was dim and warm with the smell of horses and hay and rain on dry ground, and the lightning made the cracks between the boards bright and brief. "Nathan," she said. "Yes." "When the spring comes," she said carefully, "and my uncle is fully on his feet, and he is too stubborn not to be, I will need to decide what to do. I came here with a plan that has changed considerably." He was quiet, watching her. "I have been thinking," she continued, "about what I want. Not what is practical or sensible or what my uncle needs, but what I actually want. I was not in the habit of asking myself that question for a long time." "What did you find?" he asked. "I found that I want to stay," she said. "In Caldwell. I want to help my uncle and continue what I have been doing in the practice, at least until he is fully well. And I found," she paused, choosing the next words with care, "I found that a great deal of what I want about staying has to do with 6 miles east of town." The storm was very loud. Nathan looked at her from across the hay bale in the lightning-strobed dimness with an expression that was entirely unguarded. "How much of what you want?" He said. "A substantial portion," she said. He got up from his bale and sat down beside her on hers and took both her hands in his work-roughened ones and looked at her in the close, dim, warm air. "I have been trying," he said slowly, "to wait for the right time and the right moment and to do this in the proper order, but I am finding that patience has limits." "It does," she agreed. "Myrtle," he said, "I would like to ask you to marry me. I know it's soon by some measurements. But I am 31 years old, and I am not in the habit of being unsure about things, and I am not unsure about this. About you. About us." The rain came down with great force on the roof of the Braddock barn, and the horses shifted in their stalls, and outside the lightning lit up the Kansas prairie in brilliant, brief flashes. "I am not unsure either," she said. "Yes." He stared at her for a moment as if needing to confirm that he had heard correctly. "Yes," he said. "Nathan, yes," she said and laughed, and he pulled her toward him and held her with both arms, and she let herself be held, turning her face into his shoulder, feeling the solidity of him, the warmth, the slow and steady breathing of a man who is too moved to speak and is not pretending otherwise. Outside, the storm did what storms in Kansas do. It burned itself out. The rain tapered to a whisper and then to silence, and the thunder moved east and away, and when they led the horses out of the Braddock barn an hour later, the sky was clear and full of stars, and the wet prairie smelled of rain and grass and the cold, clean smell of washed air. They rode back to town side by side, not saying much, and when they arrived at the doctor's office, Nathan tied the horses and walked her to the door. "I'll speak to your uncle tomorrow," he said. "I'll speak to him tonight," she said. "He'll be awake reading. He always is." Nathan took her hand and held it for a moment, looking down at it and then at her. "I am very happy," he said, slightly awkwardly, as if happiness were a word he didn't have quite enough practice with. "So am I," she said, and she meant it in a way she had not expected to mean anything for a very long time. She went inside. Elmore was indeed awake, reading by lamp, and he looked up at her face and put his book down. "Elmore," she said, "Nathan Collier has asked me to marry him." Her uncle's face moved through several things very quickly before settling into a warm, uncomplicated smile. "And," he said. "I said yes," she said. He held out his hand and she came and took it. "Your father would have liked him very much," he said. "Practical man, honest, works hard. Loves you properly, which you can tell by the fact that he listens when you talk and doesn't interrupt." He patted her hand. "I think it is the best news I have had since my hip started cooperating." "Don't make it into a speech," she said. "I'm a doctor, not an orator," he said. "Now go to sleep, child. Tomorrow you can deal with Nathan's proposal and the fact that I intend to walk to the hardware store unassisted." "You absolutely will not walk to the hardware store unassisted," she said. "Go to sleep, Myrtle." She went asleep, and she slept soundly for the first time in a long while. Nathan came the next morning, dressed with more care than usual, a clean white shirt and his good boots, and spent 20 minutes with Elmore while Myrtle gave them privacy by finding extremely important things to organize in the back room. Nathan emerged looking slightly flushed around the ears and spoke to her on the porch. He gave his blessing. Nathan reported. And then he told me the names of 3 medical texts he would like me to bring from the lending library in Wichita the next time I am in the vicinity. And I said I would. And I think that is the form of approval I am going to get, and I am entirely all right with it. That is very much how Elmore expresses affection, Myrtle agreed. They set the wedding for November, which gave enough time for the arrangements that were necessary without stretching it so long that the waiting became its own problem. Myrtle wrote to her cousin Ida in Kansas City, who was the only family she had besides Elmore, and received a letter back so enthusiastic that it nearly scorched her hands. Ida said she would come for the wedding if the trains were running, which they were. Nathan ordered a ring from the jeweler in Wichita through the supply merchant, a simple gold band with a small turquoise setting, turquoise being the stone he had picked, because he said it was the color of the sky just before dark, which Myrtle privately thought was one of the more beautiful things she had ever been told about any piece of jewelry. He gave it to her on a Sunday afternoon in October, on the porch of the doctor's office, while Elmore, who had finally made it to the hardware store with only a cane and no assistance, which Myrtle pretended not to be pleased about, was napping inside. She held out her left hand and he put it on with both of his carefully, and they both looked at it for a moment. "It fits," he said. "It does," she said. "How did you know?" "I didn't," he said. "I guessed. I was either going to be right or I was going to be embarrassed." She turned her hand so the turquoise caught the October light. "It is exactly right," she said. "It is exactly what I would have chosen myself." He looked pleased in the way he always looked pleased, quietly and thoroughly, without display. She leaned over and kissed him on the cheek, and he turned slightly red, and she laughed. The October weeks that led toward the wedding were full and golden. The heat had broken entirely, and the prairie was in its autumn colors, the grasses going red and bronze and the cottonwoods yellow along the creek lines. Myrtle continued her work at the doctor's office, which was now, with Elmore mostly upright again, more of a partnership than an emergency measure. She found that she was genuinely good at it, not just competent in a crisis, but good at the steady daily work, at the listening and the judgment and the calm that patients needed. Elmore began talking about formalizing the arrangement, about writing to a nursing association to inquire about credentialing. Nathan came to town on Saturdays and they sat on the porch in the cool afternoons and talked about the house at Flint Creek, which was going to need a few adjustments when she arrived, more shelving in the kitchen, a proper desk for the books that she was going to bring, and about whether they would plant a proper kitchen garden in the spring. Nathan was enthusiastic about the kitchen garden in the way that people who have been cooking for themselves for years and are tired of their own limited repertoire tend to be enthusiastic about someone who knows how to cook arriving on the premises. "I can manage well enough with what I have," he said, "but I will not claim it is a pleasure." "What do you eat?" she asked. "Beef," he said, "beans, bread when I have time to make it, which is rarely, eggs when the supply of eggs from the Braddock farm is available, tinned things when the other options fail." "Nathan," she said, "that is not a diet, that is a survival strategy. It has kept me alive and functional for 5 years," he said with perfect dignity. "I can cook," she said. "My mother was very particular about it. I can make real bread and proper stews, and I have a very good recipe for apple cake that you will find changes your view of the world." He looked at her with an expression of such genuine anticipation that she started laughing and could not stop for some time. The wedding was on the first Saturday of November in the small church at the east end of Caldwell's Main Street, conducted by Reverend Holt, no relation to Nathan's old employer, who was a man of middle age with a round face and an appreciation for ceremonies that were honest and brief. The church was not large, but it was full. Myrtle had not known how many people she had come to know in her months in Caldwell, until they appeared in the pews that Saturday morning, the ranch families she had visited, and the townspeople who had come to the office, and the women she had talked to at the dry goods store, and the men Nathan worked alongside, and the people of every variety who made up the particular world of a Kansas cattle town in 1878. Ida had come from Kansas City as she promised, looking fashionable and appalled by the dust in equal measure, and she stood beside Myrtle at the front of the church and pressed her hand hard before the ceremony began. Elmore walked Myrtle down the aisle with his cane, straight and slow and proud, and when he gave her hand to Nathan at the altar, he put his other hand briefly on Nathan's arm, and Nathan met the old man's eyes and nodded. The ceremony was simple. The words were old and they were true, and Myrtle spoke them in a clear, steady voice, and Nathan spoke them in his own quiet, even way. And when Reverend Holt said they were married and Nathan looked at her, and she looked at him in the plain light of the November morning, she felt the thing that she had been building herself toward since the moment she stepped off the stagecoach. Though she had not known that was what she was doing, arrive and settle around her like something coming home. He kissed her gently and briefly in the church, and more thoroughly on the porch afterward, and Ida made a sound of profound satisfaction. The celebration afterward, in the open space beside the church, had food and fiddle music, and a general air of a community that had decided to enjoy itself. The weather was cold but still, and people wore their coats and drank hot coffee, and ate the food that the women of the congregation had contributed in cheerful and competitive abundance. Nathan danced with his wife carefully, because he was a willing but somewhat mechanical dancer, and she led him quietly through it, and by the third song he had relaxed enough to manage without counting. Pete Granger, his healed arm in evidence, played the fiddle with some skill and apparent delight. Elmore Langston sat in a chair against the church wall and watched everything with the expression of a man whose great good fortune is to see people he loves being happy, and tapped his cane in time to the music. They drove out to Flint Creek as the sun was going down, the buckboard loaded with Myrtle's things, the books, the medical bag, the box of kitchen things she had collected, the grandmother's earrings in their small case, and the November cold coming down from the sky in the clear, sharp way it did when there was no cloud. Nathan's hands were on the reins, but one of them was also holding hers, and she sat close beside him on the buckboard bench and watched the Caldwell lights disappear behind them and the dark line of the cottonwoods along Flint Creek appear ahead. The house was warm inside. Pete had gone ahead and lit the fire, which was the kind of thoughtful gesture that told her something about the character of the people Nathan had working for him. She stood in the center of the front room and looked at the walls and the firelight and the solid timber beams of the ceiling, and Nathan stood behind her and waited. "It needs things," he said. "Every house needs things," she said. "It's a good house, Nathan. It is strong and it is meant. That is more than most." She turned around and looked at him in the firelight, this man she had married, solid and serious and so genuinely good, and she put her hand on his chest and felt his heart beating there. "Hello, Nathan Collier," she said. "Hello, Myrtle Collier," he said, and the way he said it, her name, the new name, with something in it that was too much for one word to hold, made her eyes sting for the second time since she had arrived in Caldwell, and these were very much the better kind. The first winter at Flint Creek was cold and deeply satisfying in a way that surprised her. She had not expected to love the particular domesticity of it, the making and keeping of a house, the rhythms of a working ranch, the way the days had shape and purpose. She set up a small area in the house for medical work, because the word had gotten around that the doctor's wife was available for emergencies, and emergencies in ranch country do not respect the calendar. She continued going into Caldwell twice a week to help Elmore, who was genuinely back on his feet by December, and who treated her presence in the practice with the kind of satisfaction that comes from things working out exactly as one had hoped without quite having dared to plan. Nathan was a good husband in the particular ways that matter most. He was present when he was there, and he was honest about when he needed to be elsewhere. He was interested in her thinking and did not manage or minimize her. He learned, with a speed that showed he was paying attention, what she liked and needed and found comfort in, and he provided those things not as performance but as habit. He was also, she discovered, a man who laughed more readily in private than he did in public, who had a capacity for wry amusement at the world that he kept fairly contained in company and let run more freely at home, and she treasured this thoroughly private version of him. She taught him to make proper bread, starting in January when the snow kept everyone closer to the house. He was methodical about it in the way he was methodical about everything, and by the third attempt it was excellent. "You are a quick study," she told him, cutting a warm slice. "I have adequate motivation," he said, which made her smile. She told him in February. She sat across the breakfast table from him with her coffee in her hands and said, "Nathan, I think we are going to have a baby in September." He sat very still for a moment. Then he put down his coffee cup with great care, as if it were suddenly very important not to break it, and looked at her. "In September," he said. "I believe so, September or late August." He said nothing for a moment. He was doing the thing he did when feelings were running in him that he didn't have ready words for, looking at the table's surface and breathing slowly. "Nathan," she said gently. He looked up. His eyes were bright. "I am Myrtle." He stopped, tried again. "I am very glad," he said. "That is, I'm very glad." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "So am I," she said. He turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat at the breakfast table at Flint Creek in the February morning, with the snow on the window glass and the fire warm behind them. And she thought that the sum of everything, the stagecoach and the dust and the uncle with the broken hip and the kitchen table conversations and the creek in July and the barn in the storm and the November church and the bread lesson and this morning, this February morning, added up to something she would not have traded for any other version of her life. Spring came, and with it the greening of the prairie and the first cattle work of the season, and Myrtle's middle growing in a way that required modifications to her dresses, that she made herself with reasonable competence and her uncle's admiring commentary. Elmore came to the ranch once a week now, driving his own small buggy, which he was extremely pleased about, and which made Myrtle watchful in a careful way that he pretended not to notice. He examined her with professional thoroughness and reported that everything was going exactly as it should. "You are healthy and strong and the child is positioned well," he told her. "I expect no complications." "You say that with great confidence for a man standing in a field," she said. "I say it with great confidence because I am a physician of 30 years' experience, and I have delivered considerably more difficult cases than my own niece, who has a constitution like a draft horse." "Flattering," she said. "Practical," he said. "Like you." Summer brought the heat again, and Myrtle moved through it with more difficulty than the previous year, because heat and the later months of pregnancy are not a comfortable combination. But she managed with the aid of Nathan's absolute and unostentatious attentiveness. He carried things and did not make a performance of it. He modified his work schedule so that he was never far from the house. He sat with her in the evenings on the porch when the air cooled and read aloud to her from the books she selected, which he did well, with a good sense of the rhythm of language. "You should have been a teacher," she told him once. "You are already better at teaching than I would ever be," he said. "I am suited to cattle and land and occasionally to reading aloud. That is enough for any man." "It is considerable more than enough," she said, and leaned her head against his shoulder. The baby came in the last week of August, which was early by Myrtle's calculation but not worryingly so. Elmore was there, and so was Mrs. Crenshaw from the Crenshaw farm, who was experienced with births, and Nathan was in the other room in the state of concentrated anxiety that even the most composed of men arrive at under these circumstances. It was a boy, a good-sized, indignant, very loud boy who arrived as the sun was going down on a late August evening and announced his presence with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting a long time for the opportunity. Myrtle held him in the first minutes and felt the specific exhaustion and joy of that, and said, Nathan. Nathan came through from the other room and stood in the doorway and looked at the two of them, and his face did something so entirely unguarded that she wished she could keep it like a pressed flower. He came to the bed and sat on the edge of it, and Myrtle put the baby in his arms, and he held the child with the care of someone holding something irreplaceable, which was exactly what he was holding. "Hello," Nathan said to his son, in his quiet, even voice. The baby, who was not yet in any position to respond, made a sound of uncertain but definite opinion. "He has your temperament," Nathan said. "That seems unlikely," Myrtle said. "He has been announcing himself for 30 minutes. "My point exactly," said Nathan, and she laughed even though it hurt, and Elmore in the corner politely found something to look at out the window. They named him James Elmore Collier. James for Nathan's father, Elmore for the man who had been the reason Myrtle came to Kansas, and therefore the indirect architect of everything that had followed. The old doctor, when told of this, turned away and looked at the prairie through the bedroom window for a substantial moment before turning back. "A fine name," he said with great dignity. "A very fine name." James Elmore Collier was from his earliest weeks a decisive and exploratory individual who had opinions about everything, and expressed them with considerable volume. He was also, from the beginning, his father's shadow. Nathan's patience with the baby was the same steady, bottomless patience he brought to everything difficult, and it turned out to be exactly the right approach for a child of such determined character. He could settle James when nothing else could, holding him in the particular way he held things he was careful about, speaking to him in the low, even voice, and the child would quiet and look at him with the dark eyes that were absolutely Nathan's eyes. Myrtle watched this in the first months with a feeling for which she had still not found the right word, something between gratitude and wonder and a love so thorough, and settled that it had stopped feeling like an emotion and started feeling like a fact of the world, like the creek running over limestone or the cottonwoods along the bank, or the way the sunset went rose and gold over the Kansas prairie every single evening, reliably, faithfully, without fail. Elmore's health continued to improve through the second year. He was not the man he had been before the accident. The hip had changed how he moved, permanently, and he knew better than anyone that age does not negotiate. But he was capable and active, and his mind was entirely intact. He spoke more and more often about what would happen to the practice when the time came that he could not manage it alone. "I have been corresponding with the Nursing Association in St. Louis," he told Myrtle one afternoon in the spring of 1880. "There is a formal credentialing program for medical assistants and practitioners, a series of examinations, not a physician's degree but a legitimate professional qualification." "I know about it," Myrtle said. "I wrote to them myself in January." Elmore looked at her. "Of course you did." "I received the examination materials last month," she said. "I have been studying them in the evenings when James is asleep." "Of course you have," said Elmore with profound satisfaction. "How are the examinations structured?" "Written examination, practical demonstration, a supervising physician's attestation," she said, "which I assume you would be willing to provide." "With great enthusiasm," he said. "Myrtle, when you have this qualification, and I have no doubt that you will, having watched you work for almost 2 years, I want to make the practice formally yours. Or rather ours, with the understanding that when I finally retire you will take it over completely. I am going to see a lawyer about it." She looked at him steadily. "Elmore, don't argue with me," he said. "You came here when I needed help, and you have built something real and good and yours. The practice belongs to you as much as it belongs to me, more possibly since you have done more for it lately." "I came here with nowhere else to go," she said. "People with nowhere else to go make the best choices," he said. "It focuses the attention wonderfully." She passed the examinations in the summer of 1880, sending her written papers to St. Louis by mail post and receiving her results 6 weeks later, the formal document arriving on a Tuesday morning when Nathan happened to be in the house, and he read it over her shoulder before she had finished reading it herself, and his face was so openly proud that she had to put the letter down and turn around. "You are not surprised," she said. "I'm not surprised in the least," he said. "You might have said so." "I have been saying so," he said, "in various ways for 2 years." "You may not have been listening." "Nathan Collier," she said, "I listen to everything you say." "Then you knew I wasn't surprised," he said, with the almost smile. And she made an exasperated sound, and he caught her by the arm and kissed her properly before she could direct any further commentary his direction. James Elmore Collier celebrated his second birthday in the August of 1880 by learning to run, which he did without proper warning, and with the determination of someone who has wanted to do this for some time, and is not going to let the minor obstacle of wobbling stop him. He ran out of the house and across the yard, and Pete Granger caught him at the fence before he could establish diplomatic relations with the Longhorns, which was fortunate for everyone concerned. He could say about 30 words clearly, and he used most of them in combination, which Elmore said was early and which Nathan, who had been reading to the child since he was 3 weeks old, received as a compliment. The boy was curious about everything in the way of children who have been raised in a place where there are always things to look at, questions to ask, processes to observe. He followed his father at heel around the ranch yard and asked constant questions about the horses and the cattle and the tools and the sky, and Nathan answered all of them with complete seriousness, which was exactly the right way to answer a 2-year-old who thinks the questions are serious, because to him they are. The Flint Creek operation had grown. Nathan had hired 2 more hands and added another 100 head, and the infrastructure of the ranch had expanded in the quiet, incremental way of someone who is building for the long term. He had extended the barn and built a second stable block and refenced the north pasture, and he was talking about the possibility of drilling a deeper well because the summer of 1880 had run dry in the creek for 2 weeks in August. The land was his, and it was them. It had the quality that land only gets when people tend it faithfully over time, the feeling of being known and cared for, of being someone's responsibility in the full and generous sense of that word. Caldwell itself continued to grow. The railroad had expanded its facilities, and the cattle shipping had increased, and there were new buildings on the main street and new families in the surrounding countryside. It was still a rough place in the way of cattle towns. There were fights on Saturday nights and disputes over land and water that sometimes required the intervention of the county sheriff. But it had also the solid substance of a community that was settling, putting down roots, deciding to stay. Myrtle knew almost everyone in the territory by now. She had been to most of the farms and ranches in the county at least once, and she had the particular kind of knowledge that medical work gives knowledge of people in their private difficulty, their vulnerability, their moments of fear and relief and grief and hope. She was trusted in the way that people trust those who have seen them clearly and treated them with dignity. It was not a small thing, and she knew it. She thought sometimes, riding Biscuit along the creek road or driving the buckboard out to a farm call in the early morning, about the woman who had stood in the Caldwell dust with her hat sideways and her stomach tight with worry, having lost her luggage and her horse and the plan she had come with. That woman had not known what was ahead of her. She had known only that she had to keep moving, keep working, keep being honest and practical and open, and that it was possible, if you did those things, for the world to show you something you had not thought to ask for. She had not thought to ask for Nathan Collier, leaning against the post office wall with his suppressed amusement, and his quiet voice and his steadiness and his $12 beginning, and his 340 acres of Kansas prairie and his unexpected reading habits and his whole good heart. She was profoundly glad the world had offered him anyway. In October of 1880, 2 years after their wedding, they sat on the porch of the Flint Creek house in the cooling evening while James slept inside, and the cottonwoods along the creek showed their last yellow leaves and the prairie stretched in every direction under a sky that was turning the colors it turned best. "Nathan," she said. "Yes," he said. "We are going to need to build onto the house," she said. He turned to look at her. She was looking at the prairie with a careful expression that he had learned to read in 2 years of paying close attention. "Myrtle," he said. She turned and looked at him, and the expression was not careful at all, not anymore. It was just what it was, warm and happy and a little awestruck, the way you feel when something you hoped for comes true twice. "May or June, I think," she said. He reached over and took her hand in the way he always did, firmly and completely, and held it and looked at the October prairie with her. "I'll start on the addition in November," he said. "You don't have to. I am going to add 2 rooms," he said. "One for the new one and one for when your uncle comes to stay for longer visits, because he should and I want him to." She looked at him. "1 room," she said. "Elmore will say he doesn't want to impose." "Then we'll put books in the 2nd room," Nathan said. "He'll come." She laughed and leaned against his shoulder, and the sun went down over Kansas in the long, faithful way it had always done, and always with rose and gold, and that particular shade of blue that Nathan had once said was the color of the turquoise he'd chosen for her ring, and that she had been meaning ever since to tell him was the most beautiful thing anyone had ever said to her. "Nathan," she said. "Myrtle," he said. "It is the most beautiful thing anyone has ever said to me," she said. "What you said about the ring, about the color." He was quiet for a moment. "I meant it," he said. "I noticed the sky going that color the first evening you let me take your hand. I didn't know how to say that at the time." "You're saying it now," she said. "I'm getting better at it," he said. "Slowly." "You are," she said. "Considerably better." The stars came up one by one in the darkening sky over the Kansas prairie, and the creek ran cool and quiet through the cottonwoods. And inside the house Elmore Collier slept the deep and certain sleep of a 2-year-old who has been thoroughly worn out by running at the fence and asking questions, and generally meeting the world head-on, as children raised in good houses by people who love each other, and the work they do and the land they're on tend to do. The addition to the house was finished by spring. It was 2 rooms. Nathan had simply proceeded with 2, and Myrtle had decided not to argue about it because she was right that Elmore would come to stay, and Nathan was right that Elmore needed the incentive of the books. They moved a bookshelf from the front room and placed it in the guest room, and put 6 of the more interesting volumes on it. And the first time Elmore came to see the new rooms, he stood in the guest room doorway and looked at the bookshelf with his doctor's assessment face, and then nodded once. "This will do," he said. "I thought it might," Nathan said. The new baby arrived in June, a Tuesday in June when the prairie grass was its deepest green, and the creek was running high from a good spring, and the cottonwoods were in full leaf, and the Flint Creek spread was the particular lush and golden version of itself that it only was for a few weeks in early summer. She was a girl with dark eyes and an expression of absolute quiet evaluation that made Myrtle think, from her first hours, that she was going to take her time about the world and then form a decisive opinion. Nathan held her with the same careful completeness with which he held everything he did not want to break or lose. "She is very still," he said. "She is looking at you," Myrtle said. He looked at the baby looking at him. "Hello," he said in his quiet, even voice. "I am your father." The baby looked at him with the dark, evaluating gaze of someone deciding. "She's thinking about it," Myrtle said. "Fair enough," Nathan said. "I would think about it too." They named her Clara Ruth Collier. Ruth for Myrtle's mother, Clara because it was a name that sounded, Myrtle said, like someone who knew exactly what she was doing, and the baby had arrived in the world with that quality already fully formed. James, who was nearly 3, inspected his sister with the critical eye of someone who has not been consulted about a major household change and is forming views. "She is very small," he said. "She will get bigger," Nathan told him. "Will she be able to ride?" James asked. "Eventually," Myrtle said. "I will teach her," James decided with the finality of someone who has settled a question. He was 3 years old and had never been on a horse himself beyond being held in the saddle, but this was not, in his view, a significant obstacle. Elmore came to meet Clara Ruth and stayed a week in his room with the bookshelf, and in the evenings he sat with Nathan on the porch and talked about medicine and cattle and politics in the way that two people talk when they have come to genuinely value each other's company, which they had. Elmore told Nathan stories about Myrtle as a child that she would have prevented had she known he was going to tell them, and Nathan listened with an expression of great interest and stored them with obvious care. "You are going to repeat all of those at the worst possible moments," she told Nathan, the evening after her uncle had told him about the incident with the schoolmaster's ink pot when she was 8. "Only when they are relevant," he said. "They are never going to be relevant," she said. "You don't know the future," he said with a slight smile, and she threw her napkin at him, which was undignified and deeply satisfying. The Collier family at Flint Creek. In the years that followed, the years of the early 1880s that saw Kansas continue its complicated, expanding, often difficult growth, was the particular kind of family that comes from two people who chose each other deliberately and freely, and built everything after that choice with the same care and honesty with which they had arrived at the choice itself. Nathan expanded the operation steadily, adding acreage when land became available at a fair price, developing the herd with the methodical patience he brought to all things, working alongside his hands with his sleeves rolled up and his attention fully given. He was known in the county as a fair and straight man. He paid his hands on time and in full, he honored agreements, he said what he meant. The Flint Creek cattle were well regarded at the pens. His land was good land and he kept it well. Myrtle worked 3 days a week at the practice in Caldwell, which was now formally and legally hers alongside her uncle's. Elmore continued to see patients in a reduced capacity. The cases he particularly wanted to handle, the ones that interested him most, but the day-to-day was hers, and she ran it with the organization and attentiveness she had brought to everything she had ever taken responsibility for. She trained a young woman from town named Sarah Briggs as a medical assistant, which meant that the practice had coverage beyond what she could personally provide, which meant that more people in the territory got reliable medical attention than had gotten it before. Elmore told her one afternoon in the autumn of 1882, sitting in the chair that had been his invalid's chair, and was now just his chair, the one he sat in when he came to supervise, that she had made the practice more than it had been. "I built a decent thing," he said. "You have built a genuinely good one. We built it together," she said. "I'm going to argue this point eventually," he said, "but today I don't have the energy." "Then today I win," she said, and handed him a cup of tea. James Collier at 4 began his formal education by sitting on his mother's lap and being walked through primers while she taught him to read, which he took to with the same determined enthusiasm he brought to everything. By 5 he was reading independently and asking questions about words that sent his parents to the dictionary on a daily basis. He had his father's eyes and his mother's mind, and what appeared to be a personality entirely his own, curious and persistent, and given to long silences during which he was clearly working something through. Clara was a different kind of child, quieter, as she had seemed from her first hours, more observational, given to sitting beside her father while he worked and watching him with the dark, evaluating gaze that had been there from the beginning. She was the child who sat still when things needed to be still, and who could be patient in a way her brother, despite his father's example, could not yet quite manage. She adored Nathan in the quiet, absolute way of a child who has identified her person and has no doubts about it. Myrtle watched her family across the supper table of the Flint Creek house on a Friday evening in the fall of 1882, in the lamplight, with the prairie dark outside the windows and the fire warm against the October cold. James was explaining to his father at great length, and with much hand movement, a theory he had developed about why the creek ran faster after rain. Nathan was listening with complete attention, occasionally asking a question that caused James to stop and think, and then continue with greater precision. Clara was methodically eating her bread with the focused concentration she brought to tasks, occasionally looking up at her father with the dark, evaluating gaze. Myrtle sat with her hands around her coffee cup and felt the full weight of her own good fortune, not as something taken for granted, but as something seen clearly and appreciated exactly, the way you appreciate a thing when you remember what it cost and how uncertain the path to it was. She thought about the stagecoach. She thought about the dust and the sideways hat and the bad news delivered in flat prairie light. She thought about Nathan at the post office wall, trying not to laugh, reaching for courtesy and finding it. She thought about all the days between then and this one, the creek at midsummer and the barn in the storm and the November church and the bread lessons, and the February morning and the August evenings with the babies and the porch and the stars over the cottonwoods. Nathan looked up from James's explanation and met her eyes across the table. He gave her the real smile, the full one, the one he kept for private and gave to her. She smiled back at him with everything she had. James, oblivious to this exchange because he was 4 and had a theory to complete, finished his account of the hydrology of Flint Creek with an emphatic gesture that nearly knocked over his milk glass, and Nathan caught the glass without looking away from Myrtle, because he was a man who paid attention to what mattered and had learned to manage the rest with peripheral awareness and long practice. "Good catch," Myrtle said. "Thank you," he said. "Papa," said James, "are you listening?" "I am listening," Nathan said, turning back to him. "The creek runs faster because the rain fills the water table upstream and the pressure pushes it," James confirmed with great satisfaction. "Exactly right," Nathan said. Elmore Langston came for Christmas of 1882 and stayed until the middle of January, because the weather closed the roads, and then because there was no reason to hurry back to a house. He lived in alone, when he could be at Flint Creek with James, conducting scientific experiments on the kitchen table, and Clara solemnly sharing her opinions on the relative merits of various picture books, and Myrtle making the apple cake that he had come to regard as one of the great goods of his later years. Nathan sitting across from him in the evenings with a book or a pipe, and the comfortable silence of a man who did not need to fill quiet with noise. In the second week of January, on a morning when the snow was thick on the prairie, and the cottonwoods were bare white lines along the creek, and the house was warm from the fire, and James was on the kitchen floor with his blocks, and Clara was in her father's lap looking at the illustrated natural history volume that she had claimed as her own, Elmore sat in his chair by the front window and looked out at the white expanse of the Kansas winter, and said, to nobody in particular, "I think I will be quite glad to end my days knowing this place is here." Nobody said anything, because it was the kind of thing that doesn't need response, only acknowledgement. Nathan looked up from the book he was sharing with Clara and nodded once. Myrtle, from the kitchen, heard it and put down the bowl she was holding and stood for a moment with her eyes closed and the warmth of the fire on her face. Then she picked up the bowl and went back to the cake, and the snow fell on the Flint Creek spread, and the cattle stood quiet in the pastures in the white morning, and the children of Nathan and Myrtle Collier went about the serious business of being young and curious and alive in a place that was theirs, built by their parents' hands and love and stubborn practical hope, in the enormous and beautiful country of the Kansas prairie, in the last years of the wild frontier, when everything was still becoming what it was going to be, and the future was wide open, and the land went on forever.